Great. Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Lisa, for setting it up. And this is my turn, so I'm supposed to be introducing. So we have Ryan here. I know Ryan, his wife was in our gardening club for a number of years. I've been to their garden. It's a fabulous place, and there's lots of bees around. And the way Ryan would describe himself is a man who wears many hats, a Googler by day, a devoted husband and father by night, and a passionate beekeeper in every moment in between. And believe me, he's passionate. So I won't say any more. I'm just going to pass it on to Ryan so he can go. And we're hoping we can keep this to around 40 minutes. And if you have questions, maybe you could put it in the chat and then we can get into it at the end of this program. Okay. Thank you, Ryan. Take it away.
Thanks, Winnie. And thanks everyone for allowing me to join you tonight. I'm here tonight to focus on the importance of bees. If nothing else, I hope that you can walk away from the talk a little bit more impassioned about bees and these tiny creatures that do so much for us. And I will do my best to arm you with some unbelievable facts that you can use to impress your friends and family, and might throw in a few puns along the way. We're going to cover a lot of information tonight. I warned Lisa and Winnie that I could easily spend the next 3 days talking to you about bees. I am super impassioned by beekeeping, and I absolutely love it. This will be a lifelong hobby for me, and I've been at it now for 5 years. But we're going to try to keep us focused a little bit. I do encourage you, if you have questions, to write them down and ask them towards the end of the talk. But I'll try my best to keep us on track. We'll talk a little bit about bees and their colonies. You'll learn about why bees are so important. We'll learn about their diets. We'll talk about how pollination works. I'll describe a day in the life of a bee and one of their keepers, me. And I've got lots of videos to show, so you can see as if you've been in the hives with me and join me in an inspection that I did last weekend. I'll talk about some of my favorite plants for pollinators, and then also describe how you can help bees in our area, even if you don't become an experienced master gardener, or even if you don't have bees someday in your backyard like I do. Again, I have a lot of content here. I really do want to maximize the opportunity to join you all and make sure that you get the most out of the talk. So please do feel free to write down those questions. But first, a little bit about me. I'm Ryan. As Winnie mentioned, my most prized titles are husband to my wife, Carrie, and father to a spunky 2-year-old named Rosemary and a 5-month-old named Cole, who went on his first beehive inspection last weekend. My real job is an IT security guy. I'm a IT program manager at Google. My team's specifically responsible for making sure your connections on the web stay encrypted. It's pretty nerdy stuff and the exact opposite of being a beekeeper. I'm an avid gardener and landscape enthusiast, though typically my responsibilities at home just include hauling soil and moving things around the garden for my wife and digging holes. And I'm also proudly a recovered lawn care addict, and I've been keeping bees in my backyard since 2019. Typically, when I describe to folks that I'm a beekeeper, I usually get a lot of questions. And in these talks, I find it easiest to just discuss those things up front. So yes, I keep bees. There are about 80,000 per hive at their peak population in July, and it's not unusual to get stung at least once a week while performing colony inspections. Yesterday, a bee actually climbed into my suit and stung me on my belly. You do not want to have a bee in your shirt, but these things happen. Getting stung still hurts, and it's often accompanied by a slew of expletives still. But don't worry, bees don't have ears, so they don't know. We name our hives queens, where there's 1 per hive, and we expect to harvest about 100 pounds of honey per hive, which sounds like a lot, and it definitely is. As it turns out, our neighbors think it's pretty cool. We also gift them honey to make sure that everything, stays a-okay. But the honey definitely sweetens the deal. And if there's one thing that I wish all of you can experience someday, it's the sounds and smells of a healthy bee colony. It's truly like nothing else. It's hypnotizing. And as I mentioned, I recorded some videos of me in the hives last weekend, so you could kind of experience the feel of that in tonight's talk. So bees, we all know about bees. We see bees probably most days in the spring and in the summer. But you might not know that there are 20,000 different types of bee species in the world, and 4,000 of them are native to the United States. 400 of those species are native to Virginia. Tonight's talk will mostly focus on the honeybee And it might surprise you to learn that honeybees aren't actually native to the United States. They came over from Europe in 1622, and they didn't end up arriving out in California until the 1850s. And California, of course, is most famous for where each spring we have big cargo trailers transported from places like Georgia all the way out to California, where hives are set up on farms to help pollinate crops like almonds and other things. And predominantly that's because honeybees, especially, are very predictable and convenient and consistent pollinators. So if you happen to like almonds, cherries, blueberries, or apples, you can thank there in the middle a honeybee. And the two bee species on the outer ends of the photos are bumblebees. And all of these photos were taken in my backyard, as I think is true with every photo that you'll see in the presentation, along with all the videos. So the honeybee, or the Western honeybee, is aptly named. In Latin, it stands for honey bearing. And while honey is on our minds, I'm curious if any of you know how honey is actually made. Any show of hands, does anyone know how honey is made? I'll give the spoiler. It starts off with forager bees collecting nectar from plants. So nectar is like a sugar water substance that's produced naturally by plants. It gets slurped up by a bee's long tongue, which is almost like a long flexible tongue. And then it gets stored in the bee's honey stomach. And you might be surprised to learn that honeybees actually have not one, but two different stomachs. One which is used to process honey, and the other which is actually used to consume food. When the bee is flying back to the hive after collecting that nectar from a plant, they begin secreting enzymes that help change the acidity and composition of the nectar. And ultimately, through this process, and as they return to the hive and share that nectar, it's regurgitated from their honey stomach and pass it to another house bee for further processing. And this process repeats multiple times across several bees. And what's happening is basically that nectar is being cured into what we know as honey. And the curing process mostly involves these enzymes in bees' honey stomachs breaking down the honey and then dehydrating it to a specific moisture content, which in the United States, I believe honey is recognized at 18% water or less. And that process happens through basically a process where bees are fanning their wings and performing evaporating cooling over the honey. In America, it's most typical to see bees kept in what are known as Langstroth hives. This is a technology that was patented and invented in the 1850s, and we haven't really seen much change since then because it works. At that time, those hives were considered innovative because the frames that held the bees within and held the nectar and the pollen collected by bees were removable, whereas before that, everything is kind of one enclosed, all-encompassing unit. But as I mentioned, the hives really haven't changed much since then. And the biggest threat to honeybees beyond humans are varroa mites. Varroa mites are a parasitic mite that came over from Asia in 1987, and it's one of the leading causes of colony death in the United States and other places in the world. And most famously, just in the last year, varroa mites, for the first time ever, were detected in Australia, where the government actually ended up paying beekeepers to burn and destroy their beehives to prevent further spread of the mites, given they're so destructive to honeybee colonies. And finally, before we kind of dive into the more scholarly data and presentation materials, we'll arm you with some fast facts that you can use to impress your loved ones the next time you have a family get-together. So did you know that bees on average will only live for about 45 days? There are two exceptions to that. The first is that the queen bee can live up to 5 years if the colony should let her live that long, and I'll describe those circumstances a little bit later. And the second is that honeybees that are born in preparation for winter are physiologically different than bees that are born in the spring and summertime. So in turn, because of those differences, those bees are capable of living for a few weeks longer. And ultimately, that makes all the difference when we think about beehives and colonies surviving over those cold winter months when the bees cannot leave the hives. Bee colony is 90% female. Male bees serve only one purpose, mating with virgin queens. And because they provide no other value and utility to a hive, male bees that are still in the hive in the October-November timeline in our area have their wings chewed off and they're kicked out of the hive where they'll freeze to death. Most people don't realize that bees are pretty hardcore. They're not these fuzzy, friendly creatures, although they are to us humans, to one another, it's not quite the same. You might not know that a honeybee flaps its wings faster than a hummingbird. And even in the dead of winter, a beehive is kept at a balmy 92 degrees. A lot of people probably haven't had to think about what happens in a beehive in the middle of winter. Some people think that they hibernate like bees, but that's absolutely not true. In reality, bees will cluster. If you can imagine a basketball in a big box, and bees will basically form that type of shape. In the center is the queen, and in the center of that sphere, the queen is laying eggs to actively raise new baby bees that help sustain the colony over time. And the remaining bees are basically responsible for flexing their wings to generate heat, similar to how humans would shiver in the extreme cold. And it's basically the colony's sole purpose is to keep the queen alive and keep the population in a place where it can grow and they can come out of spring and begin their jobs. And I'll talk about the jobs of a bee as we talk about the life of a bee later on in this talk. A very time relevant reminder in the video here, hopefully if I change it to full screen mode, it'll show a little bit bigger. It says it's already full screen, so maybe not. In this video right now, what is happening is a honeybee swarm. A swarm is when a colony is so strong that it attempts to naturally self-divide. And this is because the population has grown just so dramatically in a short period of time. And this typically happens right now in the spring. The swarm looks like a tornado of bees. So it might be hard to see, but you can kind of probably see little specks flashing all over the screen. And each one of those specks is in fact a honeybee. And when this happens, the queen bee is leaving the hive, leaving the colony, and taking about half of the worker bees with her. And their sole purpose is basically to go land and start a new hive and further propagate the bee species. It looks and is incredibly scary, but it's also very beautiful. This video is from my first year of beekeeping, where I had a swarm. I then collected it by cutting down a branch where they landed about 20 feet tall on a ladder. As an urban beekeeper, it's my top priority to make sure that this never happens. And in this case, I'm fortunate that the bees ended up on my property. But if a beekeeper is not diligent in preventing swarms, those bees can very easily end up in their neighbor's attic, finding their way into your home. So there's an incredible amount of responsibility to be a suburban beekeeper or an urban beekeeper in our area. Another fun fact about this video, as the bees were making this swarm, it's been scientifically proven that swarming honeybees will create an atmospheric electrical charge that compares to that of a thunderstorm. So pretty interesting. Bees are absolutely incredible creatures. I'll note that if you would happen to come across a swarm in real life, it'll look like what's pictured here, which is kind of like a big basketball or cluster of bees just hanging out on a branch. It's very important that if you should see this, you should remain calm, but you should also try to contact a beekeeper, and they will happily come and collect those bees, and they shouldn't charge you anything. Otherwise, I would say that's problematic in terms of our responsibility to the community as being a beekeeper. It is breathtaking and scary, but it's important to know that in this state, bees are least likely to try to defend themselves because they don't have anything to protect. They are looking for a new home. And given that they do not have a home, they're unlikely to attack you or sting you or your pets or loved ones. And what's actually happening here, as the bees are sitting, as pictured in the image, they're going through a democratic process, not unlike the house hunter's search, where folks are looking for a new home, where different bees are out scouting new locations for the hive to live. They will corroborate about those locations and collectively come to a consensus, and the colony will move to that location. How they do any of this without speaking, I don't know. It's incredible. We'll now quickly transition and talk about the hive, specifically what's in it. There are 3 types of bees, or 3 castes of bees in a hive. Worker bees are the heart of the hive. They make up the majority of the population, about 90%. These are the female bees. They will undergo in their 45 short days of life a number of role transitions within the hive. They start off immediately being born. I will show you a video of a baby bee being born, but they are immediately tasked with getting to work. They're responsible for cleaning, and then eventually they begin taking care of other baby bees and bee eggs. They'll be nurse bees where they'll tend to the queen. They'll become architects where they'll draw honeycomb and wax. They'll become undertakers where they'll help clear out the dead and sick bees. Eventually, they'll find their way into the honey production group. They'll become guards and defend the bee from intruders, or defend the hive from intruders. And eventually, they'll end their lives as a forager. And the foragers are the bees that we see out and about in nature. And in this role, they will literally work themselves to death to help support and sustain their colony. A fun fact about worker bees, although they are all female, they are all unfertilized because they have not been mated by a male bee referred to as a drone. A worker's reproductive system is actually suppressed in the presence of a queen. So any female bee is capable of laying eggs. You can still think of them being born with ovaries and a female reproductive system, and they can still lay eggs. But again, because those eggs are not fertilized, male eggs and the absence of male bees contributing literally anything to the colony that has no queen would only produce male bees, and that colony would shortly collapse. And that scenario is called a laying worker hive. Here are 3 pictures of some foragers in action. Again, all taken in my backyard. The foragers are responsible for bringing in nectar. We have a borage plant, which is one of my favorites, pictured on the left. We see in the middle a bee returning to the colony with pollen tucked beneath its back legs. And then also they collect water. Water is used to help cool down the hive in hot summer months and is also important for curing honey. Male bees, unfortunately, not unlike their human counterparts, like to take it easy. Kidding, of course, but basically male bees hang out all day. They eat honey, they fly around with their bros, and they try to find a virgin queen to mate with. Like, that is literally what they do. Their sole purpose is to mate with virgin queens. And you might think that that sounds like quite the life, except that there's one problem. If they are successful in that initiative, they will die instantly. You could think of immediately upon completing the deed, upon attempting to retract their bodies from the queen, from the mating process, their innards are ripped out and they will plummet to the ground from the sky and they will die. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you're a male honeybee, either you mate with a queen, you die, or if you don't succeed in that endeavor, you get your wings chewed off and you're kicked out of the hive in winter months where you starve to death. So not a great life. But you think that sounds pretty bad. It actually ends up being a little bit worse for the queen. The queen typically can live anywhere up to 5 years, but it's unlikely that you'll actually ever experience a queen that old. The sole responsibility of the queen is laying eggs. Once she is mated, she's incapable of flying. She never gets to go outside the hive. She does not get to experience the springtime and all of its beauty. But worse, if her colony perceives that she is doing a bad job, she is starved, she is balled up, and she is murdered. And the bees will raise a new queen to lead the colony. So although it is a royal moniker, she is very much a prisoner to her sisters, or actually her daughters. So it's a tough life to be queen. In terms of honeybee nutrition, a lot of people might assume that honeybees are vegetarian, but that is not necessarily true. They're mostly vegetarian, and that is because honeybees will consume nectar and pollen. Nectar is a carbohydrate or an energy source. Pollen is a protein source. And we know that through studying microbes and microorganisms, we know that they exist in pollen. So technically, these things are non-plant matter. And in turn, we must consider, because of that, that bees are not fully vegetarian, although they're not like wasps or hornets, which have carnivorous tendencies, where I've literally seen Eastern European hornets flying around my beehives and plucking out bees out of the air and eating them in front of me, which is disturbing and frustrating to see. Talk to you a little bit about pollination. a lot of you probably know about pollination. 80% of flowering plants are pollinated by critters. Most of those critters are insects. When we think about the types of insects that do pollination beyond bees, bees are pretty obvious, as are butterflies, but you might be surprised to know that flies and beetles and ants and birds and bats all are also capable of performing pollination functions. Bees, of course, have co-evolved with flowering plants, so they're a pretty good fit for performing that function. But earlier I mentioned that honeybees didn't end up coming to the United States until the mid-1600s. And because of that, if you were to compare the skill of a native bee, like a bumblebee, in terms of pollination to a honeybee's skill and efficacy in pollinating plants, native bees are much, 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 much better. And again, it has to do with how native bees have co-evolved with the plant species in this area. So as an example, a honeybee's tongue is 2 millimeters shorter than a bumblebee's. And that's often why you might see bees like bumblebees or carpenter bees pollinating things like lavender, which have kind of long, narrow flowers, whereas honeybees' tongues aren't long enough to be as effective in their role and collecting the nectar that is within. In terms of how bees help pollination, all 20,000 species of bees have hair. That's what makes them distinct from wasps and hornets. Those hairs are described as plumose, which is like a branched, feathery concept. Those hairs are great at trapping pollen. I think one of the fun facts that I had earlier in the presentation is that a bee has over 3 million hairs on its tiny little body. So as a bee lands on a flower and rubs up against it, it is collecting that pollen and transporting it and touching it against other parts of the plant, which helps complete the pollination process and the fertilization process. A general comment on how bees pollinate, although they're generalists, meaning they'll pollinate flowers, they'll pollinate trees, they tend to prioritize foraging on one specific plant species at a time. So a little bit later, when I talk about tips on how to help best support pollinators, one of those tips is planting in basically clumps, where you'd have all of your plants of one certain variety in a common area, so a bee can kind of target all of them at once rather than spacing them out across your yard. It just results in more efficient pollination. We'll talk to you about the life of a bee. I have lots of pictures here. This is a video that I took last weekend, which shows bees in various stages of their early life. But a bee starts off as an egg. I'll try to pause the video and call out exactly where an egg is. It might be hard to see based on the size of the screen, but inside this hexagonal bee cell, there's a little white, it almost looks like a strain of rice, and that is a bee egg. All bees start off as an egg, male or female. Any female egg, as it's laid, is capable of being transformed into a queen. And the only thing that is different about a worker bee versus a queen bee is the diet that it is fed in these early stages of life. Queen bees also develop from that diet significantly faster than a queen or than a worker bee. After 3 days, that little grain of rice will then transform into a larva, which looks like almost like a little grub. And that's what we see here. And in this video, you'll see nurse bees basically surveying these what are soon to be baby bees, and they are feeding them and ensuring that they have all the nutrients they need to survive this period of their life. And this larval phase will last for 5 or 6 days. After the larval phase, you might be surprised to know that the honeybees will create a cocoon, and they will actually be capped and encapsulated in their cell in wax. And that is what this brown covering that is covering over these bees' cells here. And they will sit in that cocoon for 12 days. And during that phase, basically that larva is transforming through a pupal process, and it will eventually emerge as a full adult-sized honeybee. And in this next video, I will show you a bee chewing its way out of its cell. So right here where my mouse is, we can see this bee is chewing and kind of crawling its way out of its cell. So this is a worker bee. So this is 21 days since that egg was laid. A worker bee emerges. They quickly get their bearings, and then she goes right to work. And she is then an active contributor to the health of the hive. So it's pretty neat. In terms of the development timeline, a queen bee will go from egg to full-blown queen bee in 16 days. A worker bee is 21 days, and then a drone or a male bee is 23 days. So it's interesting that the queen bee is the biggest and arguably most important type of bee, and she develops in the shortest time frame. And again, that is because of the diet that she receives as she's going through these evolving processes. Bees, over the course of their life, have many roles. I described some of these roles earlier. So in this video, you can see that these bees are actually building honeycomb. The white substance on this black background, the back background is a frame. It has a hexagonal impression printed upon it. It's almost like a guide for the bees. They do not need this guide, but you can think of it as adding structural integrity to the back of the honeycomb. But bees are actually drawing out wax in this video, and the brand new wax as it's being laid is a very pure white. And as bees use that wax, as new worker bees are raised in those cells, eventually that pristine white wax will turn into a very dark color. Typically, beekeepers will rotate their frames, which is what you're looking at here, every 5 years. And that's helped to ensure that you have nice, clean wax that is free of any pesticides or chemicals that the bees may have been in contact with when they're foraging. I mentioned earlier that there are foragers. The foragers are the bees responsible for going out and collecting resources out in nature. But you might wonder, well, how do bees know where to find the pollen? How do they know where the nectar is? This is through the waggle dance, and I'll highlight specifically this cluster of bees here. You can see them almost, it looks like they're doing an interpretive dance, and this bee's kind of shaking its butt, and it's got some pollen in her back legs. And in this video, that bee is communicating to her sisters the direction, distance, and quality of the pollen that she just collected. So you can think of this almost as if you are trying to communicate to your spouse or loved one that they need to go to the store, not having ever been to that store, and you need to tell them specifically which product you're looking for them to bring back home. And they do all of this without any words. This is an observed communication through observation and touch, and it is absolutely remarkable. Even when my wife arms me with a grocery list, I still manage to screw things up, yet these bees are capable of doing it without word. And generally speaking, the more enthusiastic the dance, and this looks like a pretty enthusiastic dance to me, that means the higher quality of the resources that they're bringing back to the hive. And in this video, this basically shows you a honey frame with lots of pollen in it. So you can see the different colors of shades of yellow and orange, and that all represents some of the pollen that was brought back to the hive. And in the video on the left, we can see bees actively basically foraging. This is a mountain mint. This is one of my favorite plants to have in my yard. It's a rich source of nectar and pollen for bees. And this bush or plant is absolutely entrenched in honeybees, and they're bringing those resources back to the hive. And on this video, what we see is a honey frame. So this frame is fully packed full of honey. Again, the nectar is returned to the hive, and then through this process of regurgitating and processing and curing honey, eventually it gets placed in a cell, and then it is covered in wax, and that wax is used basically to seal it for its lifetime. I've read that they have found capped frames of honey or capped honeycomb in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs dating back thousands of years, and that honey is still fit for human consumption. I would not recommend that, but it is known that honey does not go bad, and theoretically that could be observed. I'll share a little bit about the life of a beekeeper. These are all videos that I took last weekend in my backyard. In this first video, it's just kind of a scenic shot of the bees that, can you see these videos? Cool.
Yeah.
For some reason, I can't,
Yes,
just gonna make sure.
yes, we can.
Been a little bit maybe late in the game to ask the question now. You didn't see them. This is just a scenic shot of the hives that I have in my backyard. These are the Langstroth hives, and as I mentioned, at their peak, each one of these hives in June will have about 80,000 bees in it. Prior to opening up one of these hives as a beekeeper, you will puff a few puffs of smoke. That smoke comes from a device called a smoker. You fill it with wood pellets or natural product. Um, think of like dried grass or acorns or whatever old plant material that can light. And the smoke actually does two things. Fire is a natural predator to bees, right? So the immediate response that bees have upon detecting smoke is to attempt to consume nectar or honey in preparation to leave the hive should they need to do so. And also, the smoke will disrupt the bees communicating from one another through their pheromones. This is one of the common ways that bees communicate beyond sight and the waggle dance that I just showed you. So by disrupting their ability to communicate with one another, it prevents them from releasing an alarm pheromone, which basically tells them that something is happening that maybe shouldn't be happening, aka the beekeeper is back and he's inspecting the hive again. So by disrupting that communication, it prevents them from signaling that alarm and in turn taking a defensive posture against me. And once I have the hive opened up, um, it would look exactly like this on the right video. There are 10 frames left to right, and I will remove each hive and investigate it. And in that process, I am looking to make sure that there's no visible signs of disease, no signs of pest, making sure that the queen bee has ample room to lay eggs to help continue to grow the population. And in general, it's just a well-being and health check that is performed weekly. Some of the more exciting or at least sticky parts of being a beekeeper is collecting honey. So earlier I showed you a picture of one of the honey frames, and this is what would happen if I were to harvest that honey. First, I would use a little comb-like device to take the wax seal off those cells after removing it from the hive. And this basically results in the honey in the state where it can be easily extracted from those cells. And to do that, you put it in this giant centrifuge type device called a honey extractor, which basically spins. And as it spins, it creates force. And that force then whips the honey out of those cells against the wall of the extractor, where it then will go through a strainer. This is to collect, the bits of wax that I may have missed or, not necessarily scraped off. And then eventually you will have a big bucket full of honey and a big mess to clean up once you are done. And again, each hive in this area will typically produce about 100 pounds of honey. Last year from 2 hives, I collected about 400 pounds of honey. Last year was an unseasonably warm winter. We had a very early start to the spring, and that resulted in the bees being a little bit more productive during the time period. In terms of managing expectations in the event that perhaps some of you would be interested in becoming a beekeeper, it is a lot of responsibility. Oftentimes people ask, how can I become a beekeeper? And I will jokingly, but also somewhat seriously say, don't. That is only because it is an incredible amount of responsibility. You have at least 80,000 bees in your yard at any time. And if you're not careful, they can end up swarming. They could end up in your neighbor's yard, in their house, attacking their kids and dogs if you're not making sure that the queen is raising bees with an adequate temperament. So it's definitely a lot of responsibility. That said, it's also incredibly rewarding. This is my favorite thing to do other than be with my family. And I hope to do it for the rest of my life. In totality, it represents about an hour of work per hive per week, which really isn't that bad. In the summer months, it is worse because you are kind of in this protective jacket that prevents the bees from stinging your body and face. And on those 100+ degree days that are super humid, it's not a great time. For me, I have 3 hives, so I'm outside for 3 hours on any given Saturday or Sunday. And that has to happen like clockwork, regardless of the weather. So yesterday it was somewhat rainy. I had to be in my hives to make sure that they weren't going to swarm or do anything that I didn't want them to do. And on rainy days, the bees are less happy to have you visit because the bees aren't out and able to fly around and do their jobs, which is foraging. Stings definitely happen. I used to keep a spreadsheet of all the times that I've been stung. I quickly stopped counting because it just grew too fast. And it's also sticky business, as I kind of alluded to. Collecting honey, although lots of fun and really enjoyable to have the reward of fresh local honey, um, it makes a huge mess, even if you try to do it outside. I'll quickly close here with some tips for planning for pollinators and how you can help the bees, and then I think we'll open it up to questions. Winnie, am I doing good on timing?
Perfectly.
Perfect. All right, that's good. So my tips for pollinator friendly gardens: number one, choosing plants that are native to our area. That's a common piece of advice that I think a lot of gardeners would give these days. Native plants require less work. They're more equipped to deal with our unique conditions here in Northern Virginia, and they'll native without fertilizer or pesticides, which are some of the biggest threats to bees. Choosing plants that are nectar rich, have a variety of shapes, size, and colors are all good things. Fun fact, bees' favorite color, blue, and bees cannot see the color red. So what humans perceive as red, bees basically just see as a black blob. So blue is always a good thing. Another good idea is to make sure that you have plants that spring through or bloom through early spring through late fall, making sure that there's always a food source available to bees, especially in those late summer months, which is referred to as the dearth, where we don't have a lot of plants and flowers naturally blooming in our area. That is the hardest time for the bees because they don't have a food source as readily available to them. I mentioned earlier, planting in drifts is helpful, given that bees like to pollinate one specific type of crop at a time. So by having all of your plants of a common variety in a single area rather than dispersed out across your yard, the bees will be able to pollinate them more effectively. Avoiding landscape fabric and mulch. This will basically prevent them from consuming water. I found that bees often like to drink the grossest water that is available to them. And I'll find that if I use landscape fabric in an area, the bees can't adequately slurp up the water from like the topsoil or the mulch as they would otherwise. Landscape fabric is definitely worse than mulch. Mulch is still not great, but I understand the need for mulch, and that didn't stop me from buying about 8 cubic yards a few weeks ago and laying it across my yard. And then finally, tip number 6 is save your perennial garden cleanup for the spring. A lot of native bees will overwinter in different stages of life in that winter trash. So by keeping hollow plant stems and leaf litter available to them for their use, you help promote the growth of that next generation of native bees. So typically, if you can avoid cutting down, last year's crop until early April, that is the best case scenario. And finally, my favorite plants for bees, mountain mint. This is available in our area widely at garden centers. But Penn State, my alma mater, has a study that demonstrated that mountain mint was by far the most popular plant with pollinators and had almost 4 times as many visits as the next closest competitor, which was goldenrod. There is borage, which is an herb, has the taste almost of a cucumber. It has these stunning blue star-shaped flowers. It blooms all summer long. And the fun fact about borage is that it will replenish its nectar every 2 minutes, whereas a normal plant might replenish its nectar every 24 hours. So by planting borage, you can ensure a near constant source of nectar for those pollinators. And then finally, I like blue spice basil. Technically, it's an ornamental basil. I don't think you should eat it, but it is heavily fragrant. It smells almost like vanilla. But when it goes to seed, it produces just an incredible amount of pollen. It also, as I mentioned, smells delicious, and it thrives in our area in the summer heat. And it does well in kind of our rich, overly clay-like soil. And if you're not a gardener, you can provide a water source. Bees rely on water to drink. They use it to prepare their honey. And they also use it to cool the hive in summer months through evaporative cooling, where they basically slurp up water, spit it on the hive walls, and flap their wings. So providing that water source is an easy way of helping pollinators. And then also making sure that you avoid pesticides. If you absolutely must use pesticides, I would encourage you to do them at night when pollinators aren't flying. And that way those pesticides or herbicides can dry before bees can come into direct contact with them. But best case scenario, you don't use them at all. And that is it. I think we're open to questions.
Great. How about if we go back to everybody so we can see everyone?
Yeah.
Is that, you guys, can you do that?
Yeah. Let me
Oh, he's got his fabulous products there.
Oh yeah, I think I stopped. But yeah, we do of course
Yeah.
have honey.
I have gotten their honey. I've gotten the one that has, what does it have? A pepper. There's a little, yeah, it's really delicious.
Yeah, we've done a hot honey, which is infused with organic, local, homegrown peppers. Last year we did 4 different harvests, so you can kind of taste what's in bloom over the course of the year. So the early honeys are very florally, based on those early blooming fruit trees, and then later on that floral forward taste kind of mellows out. It tastes more like traditional honey, but everyone has their own unique preferences and taste buds, so it's hard to know what people might like.
So just let's open up for questions. Are there any questions, comments? Oh, we got a question over there, Tim Hackman.
Yes, thank you very much, Ryan. Fascinating. I know you stop harvesting at some point so the bees have enough to overwinter. What portion of the honey do you harvest before you stop harvesting completely? Do you take 80% of it out of the hive, or do you take all of it out of the hive every time you how does that work up to the point you stop?
So ideally, it's something you have to learn as a beekeeper as to at what point you leave them with enough. If you end up taking too much, there are still ways that you can ensure the hive's survival, and that typically is feeding the bees back either sugar bricks, or you can feed them back sugar water. In my experience, so long as I harvest no later than about July 1st, the bees are capable of replenishing what ends up being about 80 to 100 pounds of honey, and that is what they need to survive winter. And that does more than enough to help them survive. If anything, that's still too much and results in different types of problems in the spring. It's this balancing act where you want to leave them enough to survive, but not too much that they are honey bound when spring comes. And honey bound refers to when the queen doesn't have enough space to lay eggs, and that would then encourage them to swarm. So beekeepers can solve all these problems. It just requires a little bit of due diligence. In wintertime, I will check the hives. I can do this a number of ways. On days when it's above 50 degrees, I can quickly open the lid and look in and see where the bees are in the hive. They will eat their way up in wintertime. So if I have a bunch of bees hanging out in the top box, that means that they might soon run out of food, and then I can add food. So there are steps we can take. It is a balancing act, and you learn over time, but you can always leave more on the hives to encourage survival. Like my first year, even 2 years, I didn't harvest honey. I didn't sell honey. I mostly just wanted my bees to survive, and that ended up working just fine.
Okay, we have 2 other questions and then we'll have to wrap it up. Meg?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I was just wondering if you've had any problem with other critters attacking your hive or trying to get into the hive for the honey.
I have my hives on stands. The stands are about 17 inches tall. That height would prevent things like skunks from coming at your hives. That's like a commonly described pest. The biggest pests that I have are Asian or European hornets. They are carnivores. They literally eat my bees. I can see them hanging out around my hives and plucking my bees out of the air. But I also recognize that each hive at its peak has 70, 80,000 bees in it. So you can afford to let nature take its course. But I have not had any issues. Other pests, there's a small hive beetle, which is invasive and can like quickly destroy your hive if a colony is weak. Wax moths, another pest, but not in the traditional sense. Again, these are things that the beekeeper can manage and observe and proactively stay ahead of. But it's not difficult.
Bill?
Thanks, really fascinating presentation. Thanks for all the details, particularly about swarms. I didn't know much about swarms, so interesting to know that they do that. My question is about other types of bees. You mentioned bumblebees, and I guess there are many others. Do they all have similar types of habitations, and do they also make honey?
So honeybees are unique in that most of these other native bees are solitary bees. They don't live in big colonies. They also don't live in colonies that can be easily manipulated by humans. One of the reasons why that honeybees are on trucks going out to California to pollinate the almonds is because there's no easy way of enclosing with regularity and convenience a group of bumblebees. So bumblebees, being native bees, each bee basically is off doing its own thing. They still have a queen. They still have male bees. It's similar, but very different in terms of how they have a community. You've heard probably the expression of hive mind, where all of the bees in a collective beehive are like a superorganism, all contributing to the health of that one hive, whereas solitary bees are very much independent creatures and focused on their own survival.
Julie?
Yes, well, thank you very much for this most interesting talk. Really very, very interesting. My question is, we have neighbors who hire people with mosquito sprays to get rid of mosquitoes and masks. They come around in masks and spray, spray, spray. I would assume this is not good for bees, but I'd like to have your opinion.
Yeah, typically that is not good for bees. You'll hear about different companies offering organic treatments.
Yes.
They can still poison the bees. The look of pesticide poisoning on a bee is very distinct. When a bee is exposed to poison, it will die with its tongue stuck out, and it'll look really sad. Sad is very, it's a subjective description. It's not going to help you, but it is typical to see their tongue stuck out, and that is a common sign that a colony died from pesticides. Also, another interesting bee fact: if a bee is exposed to a harmful chemical and they recognize it, they will not go home. They will not go back to their colony because they will defend their colony above all else. So they'll basically commit themselves to die alone rather than risk bringing that disease back to their colony. But yeah, I do not encourage anyone to use these services.
Right.
I spray an organic garlic mixture that makes my house smell like an Italian deli for a few weeks before the rain washes it off. It is great. I love it. But of course, you can't control your neighbors. I can't control where my bees pollinate. They will fly in 3 miles in every direction from my house. So it's a foregone conclusion that they will be exposed to chemicals at some point, and that's just the reality that we have here.
I guess my follow-up question is, why are these sprays allowed?
Probably commercialism and the good old-fashioned US of A. Yeah, I think it probably comes down to different incentive structures. Honeybees, as much as you hear about the bees needing our help, that is distinctly not honeybees. I think I read an article in a paper recently that there are more honeybees in the United States now than there ever have been. So it's not necessarily honeybees that we have to be concerned with, but instead the native bees, like those bumblebees, the carpenter bees, the other 399 types of bees that exist in Virginia to the 400 total. And that comes down to just us being more mindful. I mentioned earlier in the talk that I'm a reformed lawn care enthusiast. I used to be one of these people putting down the chemicals in my yard. I wanted the greenest yard in the state, right? I've since learned the error in that way. And I hope over time other people do too, but everyone is unique and everyone's free to make their own choice. And we can just try to inform them as best possible on the consequence and impact of those decisions.
Well, Ryan, thank you so very, very much for taking us into an up close, personal visit to beekeeping in your yard. I love the videos, and I just really found the waggle dance really entertaining to hear about. That is so cool. And I love to know, you know what I really thought was cool was the different